Well, it has been a remarkable day, Christian, and it was only a few weeks ago, after the resignation of Jacinda Ardern as New Zealand Prime Minister, that Nicola Sturgeon said she had plenty left in the tank. Today, she's drawn a very different conclusion. Why? Well, as you say, she's had these short-term difficulties, but she seems to have come to the conclusion that she is not the person to deliver that decisive shift in public opinion for independence, that somebody else would be better placed to deliver that. And there are challenges she's facing now that she has not faced before, not least the threat of a Labour Party on the rise. That hasn't happened before during this long winning electoral streak that she's enjoyed. So the Labour Party will be delighted tonight because she does have that star factor. It also raises the question, who comes next and can they emulate her success?
So take us through her reasoning, because she was asked about the gender recognition row, about the poll ratings and also the investigation into party finance, and she's saying, no, it's not any of that.
If you take her at face value, when she wakes up in the morning, she no longer thinks that she has the energy to give it all, to give it as much as she's given it over all these previous years, to do the job of First Minister and to do the job of trying to deliver independence, quite frankly, with a UK government that keeps saying no.
OK, well, Kieran, thank you very much for now, and we'll have your report later on in the programme. But joining me now is the SNP's John Nicholson, who is an MP in Westminster, of course, but joins us here outside the Scottish Parliament. I mean, the truth is she's thrown your party into disarray, hasn't she? Because by going, it means you're going to have a long leadership election in which all the divisions in your party are exposed.
Leadership elections are healthy. Parties should have them from time to time. Nicola Sturgeon is leaving with the record that most party leaders would dream of. She's the most popular politician in these islands, and her party is 20 points ahead of her nearest rivals.
But going down?
Well, polls, as you know, go up and down. As things stand, she's 20 points ahead. She has fought 8 elections in 8 years and won every single one of them. Journalists sometimes say to politicians when they're pushed, why did you wait so long? Nicola Sturgeon has done what most politicians would love to do, to go at a time of her own choosing.
But if she's doing so well, why is she going?
Because she's exhausted. I mean, she's been leader of the party and First Minister for 8 years. She was Deputy First Minister before that. It's a gruelling task being the First Minister.
But only 3 weeks ago, she was asked after Jacinda Ardern said she didn't have anything left in the tank, and she said, no, I'm not going anywhere.
And if she'd said, I'm going, people would have said, when? You know the way journalists behave. She wanted to choose her own timing, and she's chosen her own timing and left, I think, with an immensely dignified and generous resignation statement.
But where do you go now? I mean,
a leadership election.
I know, but who are the candidates? Because the problem, as she recognised in her statement, was that she's an overpowering figure in Scotland, and she dwarfs all the people in
a powerful figure, perhaps, rather than an overpowering figure. But of course, every time a powerful and impressive leader stands down, people say, who will you ever find to replace that person? There's a whole number of candidates. I'm not going to commit to any one, but there are a number of candidates that will come forward now, and I'll be very interested to hear what they have to say.
Well, let's pause there for a moment, because we can now hear Nicola Sturgeon in her own words within Kieran Jenkins' report.
Being First Minister of Scotland is the very best job in the world.
She's leaving, and no one saw it coming. Outside her official residence, they stopped in their tracks. Inside, Nicola Sturgeon delivered the shock news.
Since my very first moments in the job, I have believed that part of serving well would be to know, almost instinctively, when the time is right to make way for someone else. And when that time came, to have the courage to do so, even if to many across the country and in my party, it might feel too soon. In my head and in my heart, I know that time is now.
It has been a challenging spell for Nicola Sturgeon. A fight with Westminster over gender reforms, a row over trans prisoners.
Does the First Minister believe this criminal is a woman?
First Minister.
I think Douglas Ross is demonstrating here a lack of understanding in the law. Any rights
There's also been growing debate within the SNP over independent strategy and an ongoing police investigation into SNP finances. But Nicola Sturgeon insists short-term pressures did not force her hand.
I know it might seem sudden, but I have been wrestling with it, albeit with oscillating levels of intensity for some weeks. Essentially, I've been trying to answer two questions. Is carrying on right for me? And more importantly, is me carrying on right for the country, for my party, and for the independence cause I have devoted my life to? I understand why some will automatically answer yes to that second question. But in truth, I have been having to work harder in recent times to convince myself that the answer to either of them, when examined deeply, is yes. And I've reached the difficult conclusion that it's not.
It has been a tough month for Nicola Sturgeon, but she says it's about way more than that. Fundamentally, she is in politics to make Scotland independent, and she hasn't been able to deliver it. Now, she has enjoyed extraordinary electoral success over several years, and for many, she's the dominant figure in Scottish politics and in the independence movement. She's the life and soul of that movement, and that makes its future very uncertain. Just a few close friends got the heads up, including ex-SNP Westminster leader Ian Blackford. Do you worry, though, that this is a setback for those who believe in independence, because she was so central to everything to do with that movement?
I think what has happened today is that we've lost the best leader that we could have had, the best First Minister that Scotland has had. I regret that. I fully understand the reasons why Nicola has taken this decision. We need to make sure, I think all of us have a duty and a responsibility to build on her legacy. The phrase which is often used, that we stand on the shoulders of giants, there's no one that's more true for than for Nicola Sturgeon as the First Minister.
It's been some run since 2014. Taking over from Alex Salmond after defeating the independence referendum, later taking him on when he led a breakaway party. But Nicola Sturgeon kept on winning election after election in Scotland, through Brexit, through COVID, as prime ministers came and went. Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Rishi Sunak is her fifth, each one dismissing her calls for a second independence referendum. The Prime Minister thanked her today for her long-standing service. On policy, she brought in more free childcare and payments for the poorest families, and said her defining mission...
It matters so much to me that I've done something politicians don't often do. I've put my own neck on the line.
...was to close the gap between the best and worst off pupils in schools. You said, judge me on my record, didn't you? You remember saying that. When you look back, do you wish it were different, that you could have been more successful in those areas in which you've had complete or considerable control?
One thing I can be absolutely certain of is people will judge me. There's been no shortage of judgments on me and what I've done or not done in office, and I'm pretty certain that will continue.
Nicola Sturgeon will stay on until a successor is elected from a potentially wide field. There's Transport Minister Jenny Gilruth, Europe Minister Neil Gray, Health Secretary Humza Yousaf, Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson, Finance Secretary Kate Forbes and Deputy First Minister John Swinney. But Nicola Sturgeon has become the face of the independence cause, a movement in shock this evening as she leaves the stage. Who and what will follow?
Well, I'm joined now by Labour's leader in Scotland, Anna Sarwar, and you've been rather generous in your tributes to Nicola Sturgeon.
Look, I think it's important to recognise that Nicola Sturgeon has been at the forefront of Scottish politics for some 20 years. She's led us through some of the most challenging periods in our country's history, the pandemic being a good example of that. And whilst I've got lots of disagreements with her, whilst I've had lots of arguments with her over the years, I'm sure I'll have arguments in the future, that level of service, I think, is worthy of respect, but also a thank you.
Do you see this as an opportunity?
Look, it's of course an opportunity to think about new ideas and a new vision for our country, but I think it is an important moment to recognise and respect the role that Nicola Sturgeon has played, but to also say that a different future is possible, change is possible, but that's perhaps for another day when I want to make the case for what I think a Labour government can achieve both for Scotland but for the wider UK.
I mean, Labour seems to be pushing the Conservatives into third place in this country. I mean, you're obviously benefiting from the Starmer effect in England.
Well, look, we've benefited a lot from the Keir Starmer effect. I think we benefited from the Boris Johnson effect. I think we benefited from the Liz Truss effect. I think we benefited from the fact that people think that many occasions both governments have felt a bit out of touch. But what I've said clearly to my own party, and I'll continue to say publicly, is the easy part in politics is to talk about why your opponents deserve to lose. The hard part in politics is to persuade people why you deserve to win, and that's the part that I'm more interested in as we lead into the next general election, is making the positive case about why we need a Labour government across the country.
And on the current controversy around gender recognition reform, which Nicola Sturgeon herself said had sort of become, that she'd become a sort of a polarising figure in that, you actually agree with her?
Look, I agree in the need to remove the inhumanities in the process of obtaining a GRC. I still think there's clarity required in terms of protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex in the appropriate circumstances, much greater safeguarding required. But were we right to support removing those inhumanities? I absolutely stand by that.
Right. I mean, we had John Nicholson sort of dismiss the polls, and you seem to be being very cautious actually about your own position here. But the truth is, you know, Labour MPs in Scotland could be vital to any Labour government because it may not be a majority in England.
Well, I would go further than that. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with John's 20% divide, but we can argue about the numbers another time. I think it's more than vital. I think it's essential. I don't think you get a UK Labour government unless you get a significant number of seats in Scotland. I know Keir Starmer believes the same. I know he wants to be a Prime Minister for all parts of the United Kingdom. That means having significant seats in Scotland, but we're not complacent about that. We've got work to do, and we want to make sure Scotland helps lead the way to elect a UK Labour government.
Anna Sawar, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's bring in the Conservatives leader in Scotland, Douglas Ross. Well, if Anna Sawar has been rather gracious about Nicola Sturgeon, I mean, your tweets so far don't seem to be on the same lines. Can you hear me, Douglas Ross? I don't think Douglas Ross can hear me, so let me bring back in John Nicholson while we try and re-establish that line. Well, let's talk about how this plays out then, in terms of a successor. You have established figures like Angus Robertson. Is that the kind of the answer to the SNP's problem?
Well, no one person is ever an answer to a political party. Political parties are made up of numerous individuals, as you know. There's a number, you don't want me to fall into the cliche of saying there's a number of talented people,
yes,
all of whom...
But is he the front runner?
Well, the bookies have Angus Robertson as the front runner today. It has to be a member of the Scottish Parliament. It has to be an MSP, so it cannot be an MP. So it's a question of who the party chooses, and then of course Holyrood then has to choose as a parliament and decide who it wants as the First Minister. Incidentally, I don't dismiss the polls as you suggested. Every politician pays attention to polls and would be fibbing if they didn't. I just remark that the polls show Nicola Sturgeon clearly ahead.
But isn't the truth that you're going in as a party into this conference next month with a lot of you disagreeing with Nicola Sturgeon when it comes to treating the next election as a referendum, because as the polls are suggesting, a lot of voters don't like it.
In my adult lifetime, unionist politicians at Westminster have always accepted Scotland's right to leave the Union. This is the first time in my lifetime that they've not accepted that right, or not at least agreed how we can leave the Union. That undoubtedly poses challenges for those of us who believe in parliamentary democracy.
Right, but do you think the party's going to do a U-turn on this question of treating it as a...
I don't know. I think we're going to have a discussion and work out where we go from here.
Let's bring in Douglas Ross, who I think can now hear us. Douglas Ross, are you there?
I am, yes, I can hear you.
Right, so, I mean, what would you like to say about Nicola Sturgeon's time? I mean, we heard Anna Sawar paying tribute to her. Would you do the same?
Well, I pay tribute to the fact that she's led Scotland for over 8 years. She's Scotland's first female First Minister. But I can't just forget about her record in government, which has been one of failure, focusing more on separating Scotland from the rest of the UK than tackling the drug death scandal, than building ferries for communities that see these as vital infrastructure links, for ensuring that our education remained world class. It's actually gone down the international rankings. So these things do fall at the First Minister's door, and over 8 years she's prioritised her party's commitment to separating Scotland than delivering for the whole of Scotland.
Why do you think she's so popular then and you're falling into third place?
Well, clearly, I think John Nicholson was just saying polls go up and down, and what we've seen recently is Nicola Sturgeon's own personal approval and the SNP's approval falling. They have rushed through the gender recognition reform bill, where Nicola Sturgeon got to the stage that 12 times when I asked her if a double rapist was a man or a woman, couldn't answer. She couldn't get herself out of that hole, and on that issue and many others, in this case supported by Labour and the Liberal Democrats, on GRR, they were on the wrong side of public opinion.
So you think she's gone because she was getting it wrong?
Well, yes, I do believe that. Clearly, it's had a personal toll being in office for this long, not just as First Minister, but Deputy First Minister, and before that, Health Secretary. But there is no denying that on key policies and the key political issue that we've been debating in Scotland for the last few weeks, I think Nicola Sturgeon got it completely wrong, and those parties who supported her got it wrong as well.
Let me just get John Nicholson to answer that.
Well, just enormously ungracious from Douglas Ross. The Tories haven't won an election in Scotland since the 1950s. He's sadly, I suppose from his perspective, one of the least popular politicians in Scotland. He would give his eye teeth for the kind of popularity ratings that Nicola Sturgeon has.
Douglas Ross?
Well, at least I'm on these rankings. John Nicholson is not, but that would be getting petty if I was to get into that argument. Look, I am a political opponent to Nicola Sturgeon. Personally, we've never really got on with each other, but I do recognise her commitment to the job, her commitment to being First Minister of Scotland. But it would be wrong of me to try and hide what I think are major failings that she has overseen in her time as First Minister of Scotland, and before that as Health Secretary and Deputy First Minister. For a decade and a half, the SNP have been in charge in Scotland. And despite being the most powerful devolved administration in the world with record budgets, they have overseen failure after failure after failure.
We're such a powerful, devolved administration that Westminster can step in and decide if they don't like bits of our legislation passed with all-party support, including the support of the Labour Party at Holyrood. She is the towering political figure of the post-war era in Scotland. She goes at a time of her own choosing, enormously popular, with a huge raft of achievements.
John Nicholson, thank you very much. Douglas Ross, thank you for joining us too. Well, Nicola Sturgeon's departure has potentially major implications for the Conservatives, but particularly for Labour, as they seek to claw back the Westminster seats lost to the SNP during her time as leader. Our policy correspondent, Paul McNamara, is in Westminster now. What's the reaction been there, Paul?
Well, there's been a lot of navel-gazing among Tory MPs trying to work out if this is good or bad for them. And where they all seem to be landing is, well, they can't quite work out if they'll get a few extra votes from this. What they do know is that Labour has the potential to pick up a lot of extra votes. This is potentially very good news for Labour, which means by default it could be bad news for the Conservatives. And among Labour MPs and a fair few people in the shadow cabinet, there is a growing sense of excitement. Look, cast your mind back to just before the general election in 2015. Labour had 41 MPs from Scotland. Today, they've got just one. Now, there's various reasons for that, not least because Labour campaigned to keep the union together during the independence referendum. But, as you heard from Anna Sarwar there is a recognition that part of the popularity, possibly a great big part of the popularity of the SNP over recent years, has been down to Nicola Sturgeon. Now, throw in a different leader, perhaps someone a little bit less well known, someone a little bit less polished on the campaign trail, all at the time while Labour is in the ascendancy, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of Labour MPs telling me that they fancy their chances of taking a dent into SNP territory. There is, of course, one other reason for a bit of extra Labour excitement today, and that's because way before all this kicked off with Nicola Sturgeon this morning at around 9 a.m, the current Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, said that the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, could not stand as a Labour candidate at the next general election. As one MP texted me earlier on, we've got rid of Corbyn, and because we've got rid of Sturgeon on the same day too, nobody's even talking about it. Great.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn could still run as an independent, couldn't we? I mean, couldn't he? Do we know anything about whether he's planning to do that?
Yeah, in the last hour, he's released a statement. He criticises the current Labour leadership. He says it should be down to local Labour members who represents them at an election. It's about 200 words, and what he doesn't do in it is actually say what he will do, whether or not he will run as an independent. If he does, it leaves a bit of a bear trap out there for his friends and former colleagues on the left of the party. Do the likes of Diane Abbott, John McDonnell say, yep, vote for my mate Jez, or do they say no, vote for the local Labour candidate? If it's vote Jeremy Corbyn, they could see themselves thrown out of the party too.
Paul McNamara in Westminster.